For me, it's becoming increasingly worrying what we're seeing. Ghana and South Africa once again embroiled in a fresh diplomatic spat following the killing of a migrant, a death in Pretoria. It's not linked to the anti-immigrant protests held in the country this week, but it seems that the line that is being pushed is that that is the cause. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I do think that many African nations are in a very sensitive moment right now as it pertains to their relations to South Africa and to the unfolding events. Of course, many of them are not reflective around their role in contributing to this crisis because people do not mass immigrate to another country out of nowhere. It is a result of the failures of the Frelimo government in Mozambique that a lot of people moved out of Mozambique into South Africa. It's as a result of the failures of the Zimbabwean government that a lot of people moved into South Africa. So as we are seeing the events unfold, many of these nations are failing to be critical. They are failing to appreciate, and I'm talking here about the political ruling elite because they are the ones who have benefited from running those countries. They're the ones who are living large currently as a result of their, access to power and resources. So, in as much as there are these sensitivities, these nations are not necessarily themselves being honest about their role and what they have contributed. Having said that, whenever we have loss of life and whenever things are this politically sensitive, people will feel like they ought to stand up for their citizens, they ought to stand up for their nation state. And what has happened here is that we've seen two different nations, actually, one being Ghana and one being Nigeria, saying that, in the unfolding events leading up to the protest, some of their citizens were victims of, something related to the protests. And we've seen denials coming out of Pretoria saying that these incidents were not necessarily linked to the protests and not linked to any of the unfolding events of the last week leading up to the 30th of June and the March and March movement activities. Having said that, I think what is going to really be important to avoid disinformation, misinformation, and just misunderstanding is that the authorities, not necessarily the diplomatic authorities, but the South African Police Service really has to take a lead in letting people know cause of death, letting people know if there were any autopsies performed, and as a result of any of the empirical data, what their investigations are showing. Typically you would have press conferences. If you think about in America, whenever you have deaths around a sensitive time such as this, you would have as much information provided to the public so that you don't have the diplomats all arguing and giving information to each other from limited, pools of information. It's going to be very sensitive for them to do that and important for them to do that, because if they fail to deal with this issue in a mature manner, the African relations are going to significantly deteriorate. And in as much as there are these criticisms of the political elites in various countries which contributed to the mass inflow of immigrants, and in as much as there may be criticisms of certain movements within the South African space, the broader continental project does actually need African unity. It does need African solidarity. There are some goals and objectives that the African continent has recognized as being necessary for economic empowerment, economic development of broader Africa. And South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, these nations have a role to play. And the big objective is to increase intra-African trade. Now, there's already a significant amount of trade at the multinational level and the large corporation level. Companies such as Pick and Pay, companies such as MTN, South African companies are operating in various parts of Africa already. There are many South African mining companies, for example, operating in the Democratic Republic of Congo. What is missing is the operation of the middle and the operation of the small businesses in these continental transactions. And if we are to empower Africans, we need to see small businesses and medium-sized businesses beginning to exploit the markets that are on the continent and the buying power that is on the continent, which is, I think, over $1 trillion US. And the whole point of the Continental Free Trade Area was to actually increase and improve the economics of Africa through intra-African trade. So if we are to have these small to medium entities operating, that's really going to need African solidarity, African goodwill. And right now, it's at risk because of these particular sensitive developments. And if the rhetoric escalates and if the diplomatic ties begin to deteriorate, then in the long term, Africa will lose, because on the continental and global stage, we need to be, operating in unison, because we are facing some very serious economic pressures in terms of, if we want to improve intra-African trade, our direct competitor to that is China. And we've seen that China has been able to escalate the quality of manufacturing across various products. They've moved over decades from toys to clothes to technology, and now they're even moving to higher end products. We are beginning to see Chinese electric cars in various markets, along with traditional vehicles. So if we are to say Africa is going to become a manufacturing hub, that is going to require not only skills transfer and sharing in the continent, but also goodwill. And we must not forget those types of, factors as we are dealing with what is an acute moment, because we've got long-term goals and objectives which do require goodwill and do require us to understand and work together.
All right, so then let's move on to Mali. We have seen a confirmation by insurgent groups there that they have been behind a series of coordinated attacks on 7 military installations across the country over the weekend. And I'm just wondering about the sophistication not only of the intelligence gathering, but operationalization of these insurgent attacks. What does it mean? Are they having a greater stranglehold on the levers of power there, or more empathy around the citizenry? What is it telling us?
Well, it does tell us first and foremost that these Al Qaeda affiliates, and here we've got Nusrat al Islam, they claim that they were responsible for the seizure of 3 military installations. And this shows us, one, that we still have issues in the Sahel region. Two, that the Russian support, which these countries started seeking, because if you recall, they moved away from French support and said that they think that they can do much better if they're working with, the Russians, and the Russians will be able to better help them deal with the insurgency issues. But as we know, Russia has been very preoccupied with the developments in Ukraine, and as they've started to take, some losses, as well as started to face a more aggressive Ukraine through the drone developments, they've really directed a lot more of their resources to the Ukraine side of things, and not necessarily the broader geopolitical, soft power and hard power that they were fighting on the continent. So as a result, I think that Mali has not necessarily gotten the type of support that they thought they would expect. And now we are seeing these reports of these insurgent groups being able to take military installations. It shows definitely that things are not good. The Mali army has said that they've repelled the attacks and that they have the situation under control. But the rebels themselves, are continuing to fight, and several towns are still considered really to be war zones. And I think this shows now that the 2021 coup, which was one that was done in the name of securing Mali, has not necessarily led to the types of outcomes that are necessary. And this may just be as a result also of that, when you do a coup, you don't always get the legitimacy and support from the international community that you need. And, this now leads us to start asking some questions, because we're now in 2026. The coup was in 2021, the second round of the coup. So as things stand, I think you are correct to bring out these issues of security and intelligence, which seem to now be in the hands of the jihadists, in the hands of these extremist groups. In as much as the army says that they have things under control, legitimate questions have to be asked now to say, 5 years down the road, how have you not been able to resolve these issues? How have you not been able to make sure that you can push back against the extremist groups There's an alliance of Sahel states that you've been working in cohesion with Burkina Faso and Niger. How are you still, facing these types of challenges? And, what does it necessarily take to be able to remove them? I think the leadership has failed. And whenever you have these types of security and instabilities, what then could happen as well is that there's a risk of another coup, because some other groups within the army may then feel that they are justified to take over because this particular group has failed to justify things. So the issues of the FLA, which is one of the big Tuareg groups, which is leading these types of counterattacks, still remain, and there may need to be some other tactics that are explored in terms of a resolution of this particular conflict, because it is a long-standing conflict in Mali and it continues right now. I'm not sure the global community is paying sufficient attention to the issues here, or if they are willing at all to deal with juntas. And as a result of that, maybe lack of willingness to deal with juntas, we are seeing the challenges that we're facing. But all of this, it just is depressing to think about, because it just shows us that we have conflict still, exacerbating on the continent in places where you would have thought that it would stabilize. Because now you have to add this to the DRC, you have to add this to Sudan, and then you really think that Africa is not in the greatest of shape, because we've just spent some time also talking about the diplomatic tensions between various African nations.
Mighty Jamie, thank you very much. That is how we come to the end of our Africa Wrap this morning. Political analyst Mighty Jamie just taking us through some of the significant developments on the continent.